I just want to start with a caveat, since several friends asked me if this lecture was going to be focused on the caste-based reservation systems. I want to say that although I do touch on that as a central pressing issue, it's not primarily about the reservations. It's mostly about the subjective experiences of education and of seeking government employment by scheduled caste persons, especially or reserved those who get into the education system through reservations. In tracing these trajectories, especially in education and employment, I call attention to the ways in which foundational disadvantages at the individual, the family, and at the community or caste level are compounded by systemic deficits, especially deficits at the level of educational institutions such as colleges and universities, and also deficits in what are called instruments of public policy, which are programs and policies related to both education and employment. What I want to flag here is how several kinds of transactions within these institutions which have policies which are to enable the addressal of inequities actually become forms of discrimination and humiliation of the disadvantaged, resulting primarily in a reproduction of a range of inequalities. So I try to do this, and this is something which is very experimental. I try to do this by looking at drawing on a diary kept by a friend who was a former colleague of mine. His name is a pseudonym. He requested that he would want to have a pseudonym. Is Malaysia, a resident of Kollegal, a very small town about 140 kilometers from here in Chamarajanagar district, which is a new district of Karnataka. And he actually was working with us on a project on elementary education in Chamarajanagar, which the National Institute of Advanced Studies had hosted, and I was one of the coordinators. I met Malaysia, a scheduled caste person, and a very sensitive, very talented, artistically inclined person. And I noticed that over the months he was constantly preparing for competitive exams, and his focus was on getting a government job. So in 2005, he joined us in 2004. I asked him whether he would keep a diary, and he agreed, and that he would share it with me, and he wrote this in Kannada. And after around 2011 or so, I asked if he could add some autobiographical details to the diary. The diary was about the exams he would take, his interaction with the government, and his interaction with what was happening in his community or among his peers. So I used his diary and his experiences, his autobiographical details, as representing what disadvantaged youth, especially youth who are educated but unemployed, and what happens to them in the larger system. I would provide commentary to these autobiographical notes and highlight the extent to which what we are witnessing is the extent to which there are interlinked institutions which actually produce inequalities. And these inequalities, the ones we need to look at, need to go beyond material inequality, which dominant development discourse looks at, which is lack of income, lack of assets, etc., or what are called vital inequalities, which is lack of education or health. But instead, we need to pay more attention to what Goran Thunberg has identified as existential inequality, which is inequalities which affect and mark persons as individuals, as subjects or citizens of the nation, or as members of their societies, in which there is a denial of recognition and respect. And it is this entrenchment of this form of existential inequality which actually has become a key form of contradiction for us in addressing inequality. That is, it disables people from challenging the very sources of inequality or those structures and agencies, and leads to, again, very personalized, deeply personalized, and what are called embodied forms of inequalities. Malaysia writes about himself, about his background, which is to look at what I call the foundational inequalities. As he says, I was born in a scheduled caste family and belonged to the Madiga. Madigas in Karnataka are the leather workers, equivalent to the North Indian Chamar caste, are one of the second largest groups of the SEs in Karnataka. My parents were uneducated. I am the eldest son and I have a younger brother and sister. When I was studying in Standard 1, my father passed away. We had only one small shack as our property. We had no other property or money. My mother and all of us, 3 children, moved into my paternal grandparents' house, and we lived there for 4 years along with our paternal uncle. After that, because of the frequent quarrels in the family, We were separated and we started to live independently. My mother, who had no knowledge at all of the world, of the larger world, also non-literate, started making a living by cooking at construction sites, spinning silk reels at home, cooking food for sale, grinding rice and millets for others, etc. Somehow she managed to bring us up. I raise this as an issue because a lot of dominant development-related discourse, although there is a lot of attention to issues of how class background, parental occupation, living conditions influence cultural performance and aspiration, there's very little attention paid to how the intra-family and inter-community interactions which actually impact opportunities, or what are called not only for education but opportunities for self-realization and for aspirations, or ways to overcome poverty. Although Malaysia and his family were fortunate to have an extended, largely supportive family, what he also indicates and his life experience shows is that what is very well known and widely prevalent in India is that when especially children lose the earning member of the family, it is usually the oldest child, whether it's male or female, who becomes the de facto head of the family. And the premature head or death of the earning parent becomes the single biggest burden on children and is often the key factor for children dropping out of school and joining the pool of child workers. And children, especially of single parents, often take on adult roles at a young age and act as parents to their own siblings, to their younger siblings. As Malaysia notes, I started supporting my family when I was in standard 10, that is at 15 years. I worked as an apprentice to a painter and he would pay me some money. That way I contributed to the household. When I was studying for my bachelor's degree, I went to work in the afternoons and evenings since my classes were only in the afternoon. I was able to support my brother's studies also. He goes on to detail his neighborhood itself, which consists of about nearly 200 Madiga households just off the Kollegal-Bangalore highway. When we were young, most men were occupied in leather-related work. But more recently, most of the men, including his own brother, continue their work as head loaders, construction workers, drivers, painters, and some go to the cotton and sugarcane mills. Most of the women stay at home and do household. Only in those families where no earning member, which has no earning male member, do women go out and work in the mills or go to other homes to clean grains, etc. There used to be a lot of alcoholism when I was growing up. There were frequent and violent fights in the families. When children dropped out of school, as their fathers were drunk and did not support their families, they continued in the very poor conditions of labor. Most of the youth in the neighborhood study only up till high school. Very few go to pre-university, and only about in that neighborhood, only 6 of us, all boys, have gone to college. Nowadays, girls do diploma in education. There is pressure for girls to get jobs to help with their dowry payments, etc. So what we're looking at here is the extent to which education has been promoted, especially in the new kind of development literature, has enabling capabilities, especially from the capabilities approach. And it has something that is a channel not only to overcome individual inequality, but also as a foundation in which national development should take place. But all of these ideas and sentiments don't really look at the extent to which family-related barriers actually are much more than what simply state-led policies can promote. And families such as Malaysia's, and as is also valid for much of India, scheduled castes especially have seen education as one of the main routes out of poverty, and also has a great sense of their own dignity, of course related to Ambedkar's movement, etc. So families report faith in the ability of education to enable the children to address their multiple disadvantages, and many families, including Malaysia's, have gone hungry in order to get the children educated. And for Malaysia, education itself was a mixed experience. In school, he was recognized for his artistic ability, which was very fortunate, and because of that, he nursed ambitions of going to art school and to becoming an artist. And his personality itself was inclined to this. But Malaysia, and for his friends and all those in this neighborhood, all from this scheduled caste, although they had access to entrance to the university based on the reservations, the actual experience belied all their hopes and ambitions, or even their aspirations. as I would show from details from Malaysia's biography, it indicates how exclusion of disadvantaged persons is actually inbuilt into many of these educational institutions, and therefore it belies the very idea that education or even policies can address these gross forms of foundational inequalities. As it details, since I was interested in art and many of the teachers recognize this, I joined KAVA, which is a fine arts institute in Mysore. I had saved about rupees 6,000 and gained entry to KAVA after the test, so he actually passes. I had also spoken with my paternal uncles and they promised to help pay the fees for the 2-year course. However, I was able to pay only for 3 months. The materials, paints, brushes, sketchbooks, etc. were very expensive. As a scheduled caste student, I received a stipend of only 150 rupees per month. This was not adequate. When I approached my uncles for financial help, they deterred, so I dropped out of KAVA. I joined the Bachelor of Arts course in Koregal, which is only a part-time course, and he attended it in the evening. What he describes is this: the teachers were indifferent, they rarely took classes. We had a few textbooks and only some of us went to the library. There were no discussions or good interactions between the teachers and students. We as students from small towns and villages were always hesitant. Teachers talked down to us. Later, after doing this course, he also goes on to Mysore University to do a BA, just a BA in history. And there he details how every month there were at least 2 strikes and classes were cancelled. On the non-strike days, classes were conducted only until the afternoon, and after that most students whiled away time in the hostels. The facilities were not good in the hostel, and I used to try and be preoccupied with drawing or writing banners, but I did not get work continuously. The students had groups and caste associations were strong. Friendships and alliances were based on the basis of their links with their villages or caste groups. I did not join any of them. Our hostel life in Mysore was also very difficult. I stayed at the Blackward Classes hostel run by the Department of Social Welfare. Every student who had gained entry the legal way had to support at least 2 or 3 other friends who had entered through what is called the back door. They ate at the mess, and although I don't describe it here, he has told me and he's also written it, they have a rotating coupon system. The student who has legally entered has a coupon, but there are so many other hungry friends, so they actually rotate this coupon between them. If someone has had lunch, someone else gets entitled to eat dinner. If somebody goes out of town, they actually pass the coupon back, only so that this access to the food is then shared among them. The running of the mess was auctioned to outsiders, and they also sought to make money out and give us food that was inadequate and poor in quality. There were often fights over this. The authorities accused students of misusing the mess and bringing in friends. The students accused the authorities of being corrupt and, in Kannada, swallowing their money allocated by the government. The hostel did not have any library facilities. Since classes were held only until the afternoon, we whiled away time. We could not afford to buy our own books. No one cared for us, and the students became indifferent to rules and to their own lives. We wasted our time, there was little learning, and students picked up bad habits like drinking, gambling, and whiling away time. Exams were held only once a year, but our performance in these were not always even. Only a few among us did well. Many would fail or get low marks. There were always fights over this, just as it was about the food and the hostel. General caste students referred to us, that is even upfront into their face, as government Brahmins. We know that even some teachers did do so. They considered us unworthy of the reservations and unfit to be in the colleges or the university, and that we were there only because the government was supporting us. There was always tension about this. What Malaysia's experience about this highlights is also valid largely for much of India, has the limited number of reports across both central and state universities have shown hostilities and rivalries between caste groups lead to labeling of scheduled caste students who then reserve and those who receive reservations as government Brahmins as members who are privileged by the largest of the government and who are actually quite unworthy of this. Intense competition over limited educational seats, deep-rooted prejudice among upper caste students and faculty, and the institutional failure to facilitate intercaste integration have led to these hostilities. So all these, to understand these tensions, we also need to look at the extent to which such policies actually then become very superficial, or because they are not implemented in spirit, they themselves become deeply problematic. As Nancy Fraser, who's written a lot on the affirmative action program in the US, details, such programs which aim to redress economic injustice but they leave intact the deep structures that generate class disadvantage. Thus, it must make surface relocations again and again. The result is to mark the most disadvantaged class as inherently deficient and insatiable, as always needing more and more. In time, such a class becomes more to appear privileged, the recipient of special treatment and undeserved largesse. Thus, an approach aimed at redressing injustices of distribution can end up creating injustices of recognition. And this, I think, is central, the extent to which there is no recognition given to the disadvantage and to the multiple kinds of handicaps that they face, both in the family level or at social level or within the institutions. And this is precisely what has become this kind of oversight of the need for respect and recognition, and the creating of this distance between groups has become the norm in many educational campuses in India, with a rhetoric that undeserving, non-merit, poorly qualified students from low-rank caste groups have now gained entry and are largely responsible for the decline of standards in education. These are compounded by hostilities between the students, and the label government Brahmin is a cruel misnomer, and in as much as which it hints at both the now undeserved privilege and mocks at them. High result of such tensions mean there are very high dropout rates, and even suicide, the highest suicide rates in even the most prestigious universities or institutions are actually highest among the scheduled caste and the scheduled communities. And the growing, and all of which are quite rampant, and also accounts for not only actual physical violence between many caste groups. So for those, while these are some of the trends, for those like Malaysia who are able to put up with this and actually pass, although as we've noticed both dropout rates are high and performance levels are very low, those who actually manage to pass and maybe even do well, their further disappointments await them, especially when it comes to employment opportunities. For Malaysia, as he describes, they have since the late 90s heard about the booming new spectral economy in Bangalore, backed by the IT-led industry, and the multiple new kinds of jobs, especially service jobs that are being available. Yet many of them, even though they apply for them, do not get these jobs because it is the lack of English that keeps most of them out. So again here, the inability to have learnt English, to have engaged and to be competent in this is not so much their own deficit as much as it is based on policies which were actually populist policies. Mysore University, for example, stopped making English compulsory and allowed students to write in Kannada in whichever subject they were thinking. Also, student groups brought about pressure to write in Kannada, and this led to the fact that many of them could not only graduate, but you could even get a PhD without actually being able to speak basic English. So as Malaysia details, it was lack of English that again becomes a barrier, becomes a form of exclusion for them. As he says, they have, that is referring to them as reserved scheduled caste students, they can only dream of English and not engage in English. And as he details, in school we were taught English from standard 5 onwards, but the teachers themselves did not know English. They memorized a few words and sentences and pretended to read. They let us write words in Kannada over the English words so that we could read them or repeat them with them. We mostly memorized the passages and could barely understand anything. We could not speak it, and even nowadays some of us can just read the newspapers. It was the same at college. They allowed us to read, write and take exams in Kannada. We found this easy and did not have to struggle. But we know now that not knowing English will not get us jobs. Many of us who have failed in the 10th standard did so because they failed in English. In college also, we were not encouraged. So then he goes on to talk about how this English itself is only a dream. So with such a background, Malaysia, after having graduated, had joined us, but even ours was also, a non-government job. And he continued into what I call the new spectre, which is getting onto the treadmill of taking several kinds of competitive exams, only to get what is called a sarkari naukri, which is a government job. It is here becomes not only his personal goal, but it is much more a collective orientation in which it is in the neighborhood there is a lot of pressure on getting a government job rather than a private job. And Malaysia explains why government employment is valorized among them. For most of us in the neighborhood, a job in the government is seen as the best opportunity. Government jobs provide security, are permanent and also have prestige. Even a low-level government employee has high status and is regarded with respect. Most of the boys start to take exams for government jobs as soon as they pass standard. Many take the exams for first division, second division clerks. Others take the exam for teachers' posts, forest department, revenue and police departments. As many of you would have read, this is again very widespread across the country. One of the most recent reports showed that in Uttar Pradesh there was a call for 200 posts of sub-inspectors, and close to 100,000, 1 lakh people applied for these posts. And as I would detail again, this is the kind of pressure they have, and large numbers apply for even the limited number of posts. So it is with this orientation Malaysia and his friends pushed into this treadmill of undertaking competitive exam and getting a government job. He himself, over the 10 years, has taken several exams. He's appeared for the high school teachers exams thrice, once for the post of pre-university college lecturer, revenue inspector, hostel warden, first division clerk. He's taken the Karnataka Education Service exam once and the Karnataka Administrative Service exam twice. While all this time, energy and hard money are expended on getting employed, it's this painful process of delays and postponements that mark the lives of all these aspirants. I'll now just detail, while Malaysia was with us, how he applied for one particular post and how long it took. In 2007 December, the government of Karnataka, through the State Public Service Commission, advertised posts for high school headmasters. He applied for it. The preliminary exam was conducted 7 months later in 2008. In about 5 months later, the results of the preliminary exams were announced 2008 June. The main descriptive exam was held 6 months later in December. In 1.5 years later, the results of the exam were announced in July 2009, and a call for interview was made. The interview was actually held then in September, almost 2-3 months after it was called. The final list of candidates was announced in February 2010, and once he made it through, the appointment letter was sent in June 2012. So altogether, from the date of application to his appointment when it was actually made, it took 4 years and 6 months. And it included very huge pressure on waiting, not knowing what would happen. For just this, there was 629 posts, and for this about 80,000 candidates had applied and taken the exam, and about 1,000 or so qualified and were called for the interview. Even as the whole process is delayed, no details are shared with students, no fixed schedule is given. The issue of these posts becomes very contested. As many of you may have followed, the Karnataka Public Service Commission had become the object of great ridicule and speculation. Instead of standing out as an institution with the responsibility of recruiting and allocating government jobs, it became a very antithesis of its mandate. It was neither public-oriented nor was it service-oriented. Some of you may have read the extent to which the board members, the final, which was in the oral or the interview, were actually recruiting, giving out, taking money, but were also, when male recruits came in, they would see them as potential grooms, and they would actually had brides with very high dowries waiting for them. So it was another kind of agency that they were also running. And followed, based on all these allegations and a review, the former chairperson was accused of not only malpractice and irregularities, he was investigated, served a notice, imprisoned in 2011, and of course, as usual, also let out on bail. And currently, the commission is now being revamped. So between just this post, as the service commission is under scrutiny, and the posts are being cleared and appointments are being made, teachers, existing teachers from the Karnataka Education Department, file a petition preventing these things. As this one is being resolved, something else comes up. They object to the fact that external and new HMs are being appointed rather than career people who exist within the system, and actually the High Court is forced to take on this course. As the case drags on, there's a compromise hammered out between the Teachers Association and the new recruits, and they come to some kind of an agreement. After a lot of delays, confusion, lack of transparency, most of them are fraught with tension, and it was in this period that Malaysia actually fell very ill and had to be hospitalized in Mysore. So competitive exams have become spectre in the lives of these marginal youth. Uh, Even as they witness a booming urban economy with new lifestyles for others, new opportunities, their own opportunities are shrunk. And more than that, it is a denial of their individuality, their creativity, or their interest. In Malaysia's case, having, by force, having to become a government employee rather than being an artist. This becomes not only a period of great anxiety and tensions, but it also leads to other kinds of uh, measures or strategies that they have to adapt. Many of Malaysia's friends, including Malaysia, take loans which are primarily not from banks but from relatives and friends at exorbitant rates. Some actually submit to other forms of pressures, and actually among these communities where there is no dowry, where they didn't take dowry, some of them actually start taking dowries just to enhance their own economic levels. So in many ways, what we see is the extent to which Malaysia's condition is representative for large proportion. Current data shows close to 7 million, about 70 lakhs people who are educated unemployed. And waiting, which Craig Jeffrey calls futureless waiting, which is a condition that marks the lives of millions of educated youth who wait for jobs and appointments, neither despondent nor wholly optimistic, but their openness to possibility can be glossed as a form of waiting that is neither straightforwardly purposeful nor purposeless, but shares elements of both forms. So Malaysia, who is both talented, sensitive, intelligent, and sincere, he stands as a test case for millions who are known only in official language as the educated unemployed. And what he experiences as loss is not only of being unable to pursue his own interests, of being subjected to certain processes, of having to take on certain capabilities which he does not even like, but it is also in many ways an example of what the philosopher Miranda Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice, which is the injustice of having some significant area of one's social experience obscured from collective understanding owing to the persistent and wide-ranging hermeneutical marginalization. His life and his tribulation represent all this, and the tensions of being caught between the disadvantages of a family, a community, and a regime of rights and development programs which really don't address all the disadvantages that he has. And here both the limitations of the macro structures and the apparatus of institutions, processes, and rules mark the life world of this individual who's identified as educated unemployed. But more than this, what we see is the outer promises of the agenda and programs to address inequality actually have in them an inner denial of addressing inequality. So what we see from this, I have tried to detail from the subjective experience and the reproduction of multiple inequalities, including existential inequality. It is to show that how they are commonsensical, which is widely held ideas about the educated employed, is fraught with contradictory transpositioning of blame. Instead of recognizing the interlinked institutional reproduction of foundational inequalities and the associated disadvantages, individuals themselves are often ascribed with labels of being deficit, incapable, and unworthy. And at the same time, the role of the larger society or of the advantaged groups are often overlooked, as is overlooked the very sharp deficits of the larger system itself. So what we see is not only a reproduction of inequalities, but a denial of the recognition and respect for the most disadvantaged, and a sense of erosion of their own sense of self-worth. Malaysia, I mean, after this great period of waiting for 4 years, 6 months, was actually posted as a headmaster in a remote village, Hanur actually, which is in the Hills, for many of you who know, in Chamradnagar district, and I visit him every few months. He's posted in this high school which has very little facilities. He's now expected to actually build the new high school. He's faced with a lot of dense bureaucracy, with uncooperative colleagues, and he actually does very little teaching, which he finds very frustrating. So what we see is the extent to which Malaysia's life and his testimony bears life, and what he's written is testimony to all this, and I want to conclude with his own voice. I am now a headmaster and part of the government. People recognize me for that. One cannot have what one would have liked, a job doing what one likes. For people like us, being accepted and recognized by what society expects rather than being ourselves becomes a life path. Mine has also been one. Thank you.